So hey there fellow YouTubers, it's Frank Bush here again. In today's video I want to touch base in regards to off-grid cooking and kind of what your options are available if you're looking at using solar panels and batteries to power, say, an off-grid cabin, or you've got a mobile tiny home that you've parked somewhere in the bushes, or you're doing an underground shelter and you're supplying solar power to kind of keep things going, to run your lights and to be able to cook food and those types of things. So in this video I'm going to kind of walk through some of the different options. I mean, obviously in the picture in front of you here I don't have every option that would be available under the sun. There's just thousands and thousands of them, but I'm going to kind of talk about different groupings of things when it comes to using DC versus AC power, how much solar panels you plan on using to what you'll be able to successfully run as you move through time, the power consumption versus the efficiency of the cooking that goes on with these units. So if you're interested in that kind of content of how to kind of sustain cooking through time and what the power needs are for those types of things, then stay tuned and I'll discuss all these things in further details, yeah? So I know in previous videos I've shown how to set up the solar panels with the battery back in the back of the truck where I was powering a microwave and that kind of thing. And that's definitely a viable option. If you have that level of capacity and you can run those types of things, then all the power to you. But generally speaking, to be able to run something as powerful as a microwave, you need at least a 2,000 watt AC inverter, and you need to have batteries that are strong enough to be able to handle that level of power draw from the battery. Generally speaking, you're looking at pulling over 100 amps off the battery at a time when you're running those types of things. So it can be very excessive on the battery. The only good part about microwaves is you're not running them for long periods of time. But if you're interested in stepping right up to being able to run microwaves and those types of things off grid, you might want to go and check out my video on running a microwave out of the back of a truck. But separate from that, I'm now going to kind of walk through lower level AC power stuff where a lot of people out there they're looking at running 1,000 watts AC inverter to power their stuff. They might not have invested quite fully into a 2 or 3,000 watt inverter and those types of things, and that's fine. It is a little restrictive though. Some of your options when it comes to what you're able to do when it comes to cooking becomes limited. So it's just the nature of, the inverter's capacity. But as you can see, this is standard kind of AC powered 110, 120 volts, power supply that comes off the wall in North American outlets. And this is really a resistive element heater. So this isn't much different than what you have sitting on your stove. Now this whole unit is designed to be disassembled. So I'll just pop this apart. But as you can see, I just plugged this end into the inverter, and I'll just slide this out and see if the camera can pick up the the power consumption and those types of things. So I'll see if I can get this on the camera in a decent angle. But as you can see right here, this is a 1,000 watt unit. Hopefully the camera's getting that. So this is kind of the peak level of power consumption I would be able to run. If you've watched my previous videos on my solar crate build where I turn around and did a full build out that powers my living room and those types of things. If you watch previous videos, you know what I'm talking about. But my solar crate that I run can power this without issue. And but generally speaking, this uses 1,000 watts. So now my battery capacity that I have in my solar crate builds tend to be 12.8 volts at 200 ampere hours. And if you work out the math of that, that works out to about 2.5 kilowatts worth of power. So 2,500 watts of power that sit in those batteries. So to kind of give you an idea of how long I could run a unit like this, you're looking at about 2.5 hours max. So these things do draw a significant amount of power. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's a place for them. If you're cooking for, say, 6 or 8 people, I mean, I've amply cooked on this in the past where I've had 7 or 8 pieces of chicken sitting on the top of this, and I was able to treat it just like I would a barbecue. So it's good in that regard. If I wanted to cook for larger volumes of people, there is no real issues in that way. And like I said, when it comes to kind of taking this apart, easy enough to clean off the grill. These units just pop out. This all comes out, and I can, easily turn around and wash whatever units and stuff. But there is a definitely a significant amount of weight in this ceramic, you know, container that sits there. So it's not something that's easily portable by weight. It does have some bulk on that, but if you're running a 1,000-watt inverter and you want the option to be able to kind of reach the status of barbecuing, this could be an option for you. But the one thing to kind of be mindful of when you're off grid and you're wanting to kind of run this for multiple days, though, given the fact that it's using up 1,000 watts worth of power per hour, you know, that's gonna eat away a little less than half your battery capacity within an hour. So in order to kind of keep that going through time, you're gonna have to be producing ample amounts of power. You know, and I know there's a lot of people out there that say, oh, a 200-watt solar panel sitting out in the sun for 5 hours a day will give you that 1,000 watts. And that's not really quite true, because normally solar panels don't produce that much. But, you know, they always underperform to what they're rated for and those types of things. So when it comes to being able to run things like this, honestly, I would say if you want to run this, I mean, don't get me wrong, I can turn around and cook, you know, a steak on this or burger patties in a half hour's time. But, you know, so I'm only be using 500 watts. But if I wanted to cook chicken, it's closer to 45 minutes or so. You know, it takes a little bit longer to make sure you don't have any salmonella or trichina or scaris or any of that business going on in your food, right? But all that's going to do is draw down on your batteries and stuff harder, you know, and it's going to make it that you're going to need larger batteries and larger solar arrays to be able to run these types of things. Luckily for me, I'm in the situation where that's not really a huge factor. But if I was to run just this unit and I knew I was relying on this every day off grid, you know, to be able to do a lot of my cooking, I would want to have at least probably 600 to 800 watts worth of solar panels with me when I was out in the field. So if you've watched previous videos of mine, you'll see how big the, you know, 200-watt solar panels are. They can be a fair size. I've got briefcase ones that I can kind of collapse down and take with me, and I've got foldable ones that are, you know, flexible and those types of things. But it's still a fairly large unit. And, you know, it becomes a larger commitment to solar technology if you're wanting to primarily rely on it for your cooking needs. But I'll kick over to other items that kind of sit up in this range now, you know, and kind of walk through those as well, yeah? So I'm sure this technology is really familiar to a lot of people, you know. This looks just like a standard stove element that you get, and these are really apartment-sized stove elements. You know, you've got a little controller to control the amount of power flow, and you can see by the back here, we're using, hopefully the camera's getting that, we're using a 120 volts, and it's a 1,000-watt unit. So this again kind of pushes the upper limit of what you'd be able to do on a 1,000-watt AC inverter. You know, that's really just driving that AC inverter to its max capacity. You know, lower grade AC inverters might not be able to handle running these for more than, say, 5 minutes before they time out, even though they say they can handle 1,000. The cheaper ones, you know, might be 950 watts type of thing. I've got a good grade, you know, high quality one from Renogy, and it lasts up to 11 to 1,200 watts before it wants to pop after 5 minutes, you know, so I'm safe within that range. But either way, this is using about the same amount of power as the previous item I've shown, so you end up in the same situation. If you're wanting to have the convenience of kind of stove elements that are existing in your off-grid setup, yeah, these are cheap and readily available, but they consume, in my perspective, massive amounts of power. You know, it's they are good to have for, you know, feeling like you're living like you would when you were in the cities and those types of things. But to me, they're really, in my perspective, highly inefficient units. You know, this is another one of those situations where if I was running this for 2 hours a day or so, you know, I'm drawing off the better part of my battery stack that I have. And that's two 12-volt, 100 ampere hour batteries. Those are fairly significant themselves. So, you know, being able to run this for 2.5 hours or so at max off of those batteries, I'd be hitting the batteries hard and draining them almost to dead pretty well every day. So even though it is, you know, you do have the capability to be able to run this level of technology, generally speaking, when I'm off grid, I don't find AC powered units are really the ideal option to go with. I'm potentially in the future, in one of my previous videos, I did I'll just kind of quickly sidetrack here. I did a a really ultra efficient DC powered stove, and I'll talk about that shortly in the video, but potentially I'll be doing an AC version of that as well, where it uses really, really small amounts of power in comparison to something like this, but I'll save that for a future time. But either way, generally speaking, I find that, using AC power, if you're wanting to go off grid, isn't necessarily the best option for, battery use and power consumption and those types of things. There's definitely some far more efficient options out there as you move into the 12 volt DC world and that type of thing. So I'll shift gears here and I'll start talking about some of those items, yeah? All right, so for the next item I'll kind of discuss, this is a Road Pro kind of lunchbox cooker, if you will. So if you've watched previous videos of mine, in the truck camping video, I think I did a video or two ago, I used this in detail, and you can see the full functioning performance of this as I went through my video and through time. But generally speaking, this unit is a cigarette lighter adapter, 12 volt unit. He uses about 120 watts worth of power. Sometimes that drops depending on what you're cooking, those types of things. But it really kind of gives me a quasi mini oven environment that I can cook in. I can set trays in here of food. I've cooked rice and lots of different pastas and all sorts of things in this in the past. But generally speaking, this is, in my perspective, a fairly good multi-use tool in the regards of I can wrap up a few things and throw them in here and cook it as though it was like an oven, or I can also turn around and cook off things like rice and boil them off and that type of thing. When it comes to the power consumption over an hour time, to give you an idea, if I threw in a cup of dry rice in here and 2.5, 3 cups of water, I can cook that rice right to full in under an hour's time. And like I say, the power consumption of this unit is about 110, 120 watts. So over the span of an hour, I'm only using 120 watts worth of power when it comes to successfully being able to kind of cook a meal off of this. Whereas, like I say, I'll just pull that in. Like I say, something like this, I'm using way, way more power. And, it might be a little bit faster to turn around and bring up a pot of 3 cups of water to a boil and throw the rice into that and those types of things. But realistically, that's probably going to take me, half an hour to 45 minutes on this unit. Whereas being able to do it on this unit takes me, 15 minutes more, but the amount of power I save here is substantial. When I'm talking savings of roughly 850 watts worth of power off my battery to be able to achieve the same type of thing, that's consequential when it comes to producing solar power. The less you consume, the less you need to produce as you move through a daily basis. So I definitely recommend items like these Road Pro cookers, the little Road Pro oven here. I definitely recommend items like this. They're cheap, it's only 40 or 50 bucks, I think, on eBay or Amazon, those types of things. They're relatively inexpensive units. They've lasted me. This one I've had for years, and I've used it, tons of times, and it's worked without issue. It's worked flawlessly. And when it comes to, like I say, small scale oven cooking, or potentially wanting to be able to cook off liquids, and steam them and those types of things, Road Pro ovens are great little units in that regard. So when it comes to pulling off your batteries now, we're talking about being able to pull off the same batteries that the other AC elements used, that, after 2.5 hours, the batteries were dead. That potentially this is closer to being able to run for 20 hours worth of time before those batteries are going to be dead. So I'm going to be able to cook significantly more food over time and use less power by using 12 volt technology, generally speaking, from my perspective. So I'll cut it here and I'll show you some other 12 volt units that I have, because I like using them and I think they're fairly efficient when it comes to things. And then I'll move on to water and how to boil water efficiently. And then I'll go into some of the previous projects that I've made trying to make ultra efficient 12 volt devices. But so stay tuned and I'll kind of walk on to the next units, yeah? Okay, so what I have here is another couple Road Pro items. I really like the Road Pro stuff. I'm not, sponsored by them or anything else, but I think that the quality of what they build versus the cost of what they offer, it's good. Now, like I say, these are both 12-volt units, and I'm just showing both of these at the same time because they're very similar products and they kind of have similar performance. This one is more like a cooking pot, and I've shown this in previous videos as well. You simply plug it into a cigarette lighter adapter, and it uses about the same amount of power. It's using 12 volts, you know, off my batteries because I use lithium iron phosphate. It runs a little bit higher voltage, but you're looking at running, you know, within reason, 12 volts at 10 amps or so. So it's, you know, these aren't hard units that hit in the batteries. You know, they're just as efficient as the Road Pro oven in my perspective. Now, to give you an idea, a large can of soup or stew that if you threw in here, normally comes up to a simmer in about half an hour. So, you know, when it comes to cooking large scale stuff, it could potentially take a little longer, if you will, if you were cooking off enough for 2 to 3 people. You know, I prefer cooking larger portions of rice. Like I say, if I'm doing rice off for 2 or 3 people, I like using the Road Pro oven instead. But this is good for if I wanted to cook off a couple cans of stew in half an hour, 45 minutes, that type of thing, and bring it up to a boil, enough for me and another person. You know, and like I say, that uses roughly about 120 watts an hour. So it's another one of those efficient things where, you know, you can run these things for 20 hours or so before those batteries are going to be fully dead. You know, when it comes to running off-grid cooking scenarios, you could have a few days of inclemental weather where you're needing to be as efficient as you can on your batteries because you're also going to be running lighting systems and potentially a radio or something as well, you know, in the background. And those all consume power, right? So efficiency is king when you're in an off-grid scenario. And that's one of the key reasons why I like these, you know, commercially available products. This here is kind of their frying pan version, if you will. And it uses about the same amount of power. Again, it's 120 watt unit running off the cigarette adapters, 12 volts, you know, 10 amp stuff. But this is, you know, I'd use this more for, it's got a little bit of a wider base and it's, you know, kind of not as deep as the pot and that kind of thing. So if I was cooking off some eggs and that kind of stuff, you know, generally speaking, or I wanted to cook off some veggies and that kind of stuff, I generally use this one over the pot. The pot, you know, I normally use for stews and those types of things. But the performance is very similar, and really just depending on what you're cooking, you know, which option do you want to go with. One of the good parts about my setups is I normally have multiple cigarette lighter adapters in my kits, so I can turn around and plug in 2 or 3 of these units at a time into my batteries and be able to run them all at the same time and still be using less electricity than a single one of those, say the AC element that I showed earlier, the stove element there. You know, I'm still using less power per hour to run all 3 of these. Let me just pull this back into the camera again, see if I can get it in. You know, when it comes to, let me see here, being able to run, I know, sorry about the camera work, but, you know, it is what it is. But being able to run all 3 of these units, you know, I'm looking at only using about 360 watts an hour. That's still less than half of what it would be to run this for an hour, you know? So when it comes to 12 volts cooking capabilities, I really think they far surpass the AC cooking options that are available in the market if you're looking at being really lean and efficient with your power consumption. And like I say, I could throw in enough rice into this to feed a family of 4 and potentially have some meat going off in here and some veggies or something going off in here. I could do a full-scale meal that would be large enough to feed an entire family off of this cooking setup, and easily be able to run that off of a battery stack off-grid where I was only using, say, you know, 400 watts worth of solar panels. And you know, and was able to run this stuff easily and keep good capacity to my batteries and run my lights and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, just by switching down to the 12 volt options, instead of having to run 600 or 800 watts of solar panels that I would with the AC options, going with these DC options allows me to cut down my solar panels in half, if you will, and still be able to kind of get good performance out of them. I've shown in previous videos where I've literally turned around and, well, I don't know if I showed that in a full video or not. Maybe I'll do that as a future video, but I've run these directly right off of solar panels without having a battery involved at all, where I just plug in, I've got an adapter that I built out that allows me to plug into solar panels and straight into a cigarette lighter, which then feeds right into these units with no battery involved whatsoever. And if I haven't shown that out, I'll do that in one of my near-term future videos. But either way, I can't help but emphasize the fact of, in my lens, 12-volt cooking options when it comes to off-grid is a better solution. It allows you to cook more volume, it allows you to cook for longer duration and not be hitting your batteries as hard. I'll show the batteries that I'm using and kind of what I see as being a minimal base level if you're looking at doing off-grid cabins and those types of things and near the end of this video. But either way, I'll kind of wrap up this portion of the video and I'll move on to talking about, some of the units that I've built now that are trying to do more advanced 12-volt cooking that uses even less energy. Yeah. So now if you're feeling brave and you want to kind of build out your own stuff and move into even more efficient 12-volt stuff, I mean, to me, the quest is always, how do I successfully cook meals and use as little power as possible? That's, really been my primary objective when it comes to these units. I did full detailed videos of both of these units and the build out of them. And I'll kind of just quickly touch base on this because there is full videos where I go across all of this in probably overkill detail in previous videos. But generally speaking, I built this out as my very first prototype. There were some design flaws to it, but I still find that, when it's up to temperature, these use a different technology. They use a PTC thermistor technology. So that's what these little silver units are on the top here. And in essence, what ends up happening is, as these units increase in temperature, they decrease in the amount of power that they rely on. And you can get them in 12 volts, or you can get them in 120 volt, and it really doesn't matter too much whether it's AC or DC power. It's more about what level of voltage you're running at. But these units, this, even though I successfully wasn't able to bring 2 cups of water to a boil, it is an effective heater. It's an effective, warmer, if you will. So if I've cooked off a meal and I want to keep it warm over an extended period of time, I simply just transfer my pot that I've cooked in over to this element. And if I remember correctly, this only used about 40 watts once it was up to temperature. It was really, really efficient. And what that does is it doesn't cook the food really, but it allows it to stay warm for extended periods of time. So if I turn around and made a meal, went off into the field for an hour or so, I could easily just leave the pot sitting on here, come back in an hour from there. My food's not going to be overcooked from using this, but it will keep it hot so that it's ready when I get back, back to camp, if you will, and just want to have the hot meal an hour or two later. So, but this unit here, this really is kind of the latest development that I've done. This is 12 volt based as well. And I built on some gator clips here that are removable and that type of thing. I want to advance these out. These are all both really just prototypal models. But this unit here is probably the most efficient stove element on the planet. I haven't seen anything that even competes with this. Now, I'll just slide this one out of the way for a second, because like I said, that was the first prototype. And I'll just kind of give a comparative to a standard, AC 1000-watt element. So it's roughly, the actual element surface is roughly the same size. And with this technology, I'm using the PTC thermistors as well here, and at peak power, this uses about 240 watts worth of power. And then once it comes up to temperature, the power demand drops down to anywhere from 50 to 100 watts, I've found, depending on, once it comes right up to temperature, if there's no load on it, and it's been sitting like that for 5 minutes, it'll drop down to closer to 50 watts worth of power, but it'll run at about 100 watts worth of power when it comes to kind of running mode, generally speaking. And if I turn around and put 2 cups of water on here and brought it to a boil. I timed that out in previous videos. It took me 28 minutes to bring, I'm at sea level, it took me 28 minutes to bring ice cold water out of the fridge up to a full rolling boil. Like I said, did that in 28 minutes. To do that on a stove element like this, potentially I could do that in 15 to 20 minutes. So I save a few minutes on bringing that water up to a boil, but it's not a real consequential amount. But the key difference really is this uses about 1/10 of the power of this unit. So when you're out in the field and you're off-grid or running in, tiny homes and off-grid cabins and those types of things, this thing, for every 1 hour of use you're getting out of this, I'm getting 10 hours use roughly out of this, maybe 8, if I wanted to be more conservative of things. But I also don't have the power inverters involved and the extra cost that goes on with being able to run AC technology. It's one of those things where I'm going to probably build out an AC version of this so I can use it with inverters, where I should get similar performance to what I'm getting out of here, but just so that it runs off 120 volt and I can just plug it into an AC outlet, just to replace my need for relying on any of these type of old school AC electric elements, entirely. But like I said, I've done full videos on this. If you want to kind of go back and see how I've done this, I use aerogel and PTC thermistors and aluminum as the sheeting on the top and stuff. It really is a truly efficient material, project to make. Ultra efficient stove and that kind of thing. But if you're interested in kind of pursuing how to do this type of technology, I've got previous videos on that, like I say. But I'll stop rambling because I know I kind of get a bad habit of that, and I'll move on to the next step of the video where I start talking about kind of bringing water up to a boil and how much energy production is used and that type of thing, yeah? So now obviously I could use this stove element and throw a couple cups of water into a pot and just throw it on there. And, I could do the same with this saucepan from Road Pro. When it comes to, say, 2 cups of water in here, it's going to take me about half an hour or so. So when it comes to the use of power, it's using, 60, 70 watts, somewhere in around that range if I wanted to just make some water for a coffee. But really, the more efficient way to go about things from my lens, let me just adjust the camera a bit here and see if I can kind of move some of the distractions out of the way. So when it comes to smaller scale stuff, if I'm just wanting to boil off a couple cups of water, I just use one of these little immersive heaters. They're 12 volt units, plugs into a cigarette lighter adapter. This uses about 10 amps as well, so it uses about 120 watts worth of power. And I've used this in multiple videos in the past. It might look a little different. I didn't like the gauge of the wire that was on these units. You buy these on eBay, they're say $5-10 each. They're only cheap units. But what I did was I opened up the casing here and I switched up to a larger gauge wire to handle the amps better. I didn't feel that the wiring that was on there was really designed to handle the level of amps that were being thrown through it. So, they had little like 18 gauge or 16 gauge wires. I moved it up to like a 14 gauge, and I don't get the heat in the wire, and it should make this unit last way longer, just as kind of side comments. But as it goes for bringing 2 cups of water up to a good hot temperature where I'm able to have a morning coffee, this thing is probably the most efficient use that I know of out of all the different technology. When I just want to whip off a coffee, 10-15 minutes, I stick this, there's a little edge right on the side here, I just stick that right onto my coffee pot, sink it in, plug it in, 10-15 minutes later, I'm ready to have myself a hot coffee. So it's good in that regard. But obviously you're not doing off liters of water or gallons of water, if you will. This just won't have the capacity to do that. You'd have to use multiple of these units in the water at one time. So if you wanted to kind of move up to having larger amounts of water boiled off, this is another AC powered unit. As you can see, it's just a 3-prong 110 volt 120 volt AC power. And this is a 1,000 watt unit, and this is really designed it's got like a metal protector on it, and I'll see if I can get the camera on a good angle in there. There's these resistive elements just like existed in the other AC technology that I showed earlier in the video, but it's got this protective sheath around it. And what this allows is I can have a 5-gallon bucket where I just fill the bucket up, I set this down into the bucket, and then plug it in. So it's really, really simple. Then it allows me to, like I say, use plastic buckets and those types of things if I wanted to kind of heat up larger volumes of water. This by far is probably the most efficient way to do off if you were wanting to create enough water, kind of give yourself a horse bath or that type of thing, if you will. When you're off grid and you're wanting to get large amounts of water, that can become problematic without having hot water tanks and those types of things. This option is definitely a viable option for that. To bring up 5 gallons of water in a 5-gallon bucket, to bring that up to a temperature where it's hot enough for me to kind of use as sink water, or use to kind of cleanse myself with and that kind of thing. I can get up to the point where it's almost going to scald you within about half an hour, 45 minutes. So at 500 watts worth of power, it's going to bring up 5 gallons of water to 65, 70 degrees Celsius. I can't think of what that is offhand. It's got to be somewhere around 120, 130 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm ballparking, don't get me wrong. I'm Fahrenheit I haven't used strongly for years, so I really tend to be more Celsius oriented when it comes to temperatures. Just the nature of me. But easily enough to get it up to the point where this thing, don't get me wrong, this thing, if you left it sit in longer, this thing can get up to 180, 190 degrees Fahrenheit, 80, 90 degrees Celsius in the water. It can get really, really hot. So if you let it sit for an extra 20 minutes, half an hour, left it plugged in for closer to an hour. But like I say, this is still one of those units where this is pulling 1,000 watts steady, right? So this is primarily for just wanting to do off larger volumes of water, and not necessarily every day that you're even doing this, but just when you need to have a significant amount of larger amount of water, where say potentially I brought up a 5-gallon bucket up to 180, 190 degrees Fahrenheit, near a boil Celsius, if you will. If I wanted to kind of bring that right up to a hot temperature and then add it to some cool water, I could create myself a lukewarm bath and those types of things, right? Now, it gives me that level of capacity to do those types of things, but generally speaking, I'm doing off smaller volumes of water for, freeze-dried meals, or for making myself a hot coffee in the morning and that kind of thing. And the smaller immersion heater is really kind of the more prudent option that I would go with. But hopefully that gives you an idea, generally speaking. I'll shift over and kind of show the battery size stack, and just kind of make comment about the solar panels and that kind of stuff, and then I'll start to wrap this video up. Yeah, so like I say, I'll just kind of make quick comment now to the level of battery capacity. In my perspective, that's kind of a minimal level of capacity. Now let me just move these. This is just some solar panel wire connectors. There's MC4 connections on them, so I just keep them in the box to have them readily available when I'm out in the field. But generally speaking, these are 12 volt 100 ampere hour batteries. I've got 2 of them in this box, and they're just wired together in parallel, so positive to positive, negative to negative. Yeah, really simple connections. And then I've got a solar charge controller sits here, allows me to take solar panels in. Hopefully the camera's getting that, but allows me to take a solar panel charge in from the solar panels, feed it through this. This controls it to the correct voltage for these batteries. And then when it comes to the type of batteries I'm using here, these are lithium iron phosphate batteries. If you're going off-grid scenario and you're wanting to have batteries that last a significant length of time, lithium iron phosphate to me are the option to go with. Sealed lead acids, and those types of things, the gel batteries and all that stuff, all the lead-based technology to me is inferior to these batteries. Generally speaking, with a sealed lead acid battery, you never want to run it down below 50% capacity, because it starts to do damage to the battery. And the cycle life of the batteries for sealed lead acid are somewhere around 500 or so. So, at best, You know, if you're really ginger with your batteries when you're running sealed lead acids and those types of things, you're being really delicate with them. You're never, you know, drawing them down below 50% capacity and all that kind of shenanigans that goes on with them. You're still only going to get 5 to 8 years shelf life out of them before you're having to replace your stack, if you will. Then when it comes to lithium iron phosphate batteries, that simply isn't the case. You can run them from 100% down to, you know, 0%. I don't recommend that. I always recommend, you know, potentially running them between about 80% full to about 20% full, you know, to keep them ideally operating for longevity's sake. But you can, without doing any significant damage to them, run them, you know, and get 100% of the capacity out of them. So that can be significant when it comes to kind of, if you're in an off-grid situation where you're wanting, you know, your primary stacks of batteries to last as long as possible. You know, if you treat these really well and you know, you kind of keep a good eye on the levels so that they never get drained down too far and stuff, you can easily get well over 10 years, closer to 15 to 20 years of use out of these and still have usable amounts of power. You know, that's to me, this would be kind of the lower level that you would use when it comes to capacity. Now, I have 2 stacks of these. I've got another stack just sitting off camera over here. That was part of my solar living room builds that I showed in previous videos and that type of thing. And this is just one I have out in the truck. But I'll kind of stop and make quick mention about the inverters and those types of things if you do plan on using AC equipment as well, yeah? And I'll just add that into the video. So then, like I say, on my other crate, and I've done a full detailed video on exactly how I built this out. And this is really to run my solar powered living room. But this has a 1,000-watt inverter that sits on here. And as you can see, I've got AC plugs in. Hopefully the camera's picking that up. I got AC plugs in here. So I could potentially run the AC units that I showed the early ons of this video off of this unit. But generally speaking, if you're wanting to go off grid, you know, limiting yourself down to a 1,000-watt inverter can be prohibitive. And when it comes to the things you want to run, my recommendation to anybody is, if you really want to step up to having larger scale abilities, then going up to say like a 2,000-watt inverter is more of the option to go with. Then it allows you to run microwaves like I've shown in previous videos out of the back of the truck and that kind of thing. But it allows you to run those kind of larger scale appliances at the same time as you're running your lighting systems and those types of things. So this 1,000-watt inverter was really good because it all sat into the box. I've got batteries down here. These are lithium iron phosphates as well. Like I said, I showed a full detailed build on this, but it's the same where I've got 2 12-volt batteries. They've got 100 ampere hours each, and they're both lithium iron phosphate, and they're connected in parallel, right? So I'll just do a quick show of the kind of scale of the inverter that you should step up to, and then I'll wrap this video up, yeah? So then, like I say, just as a quick example, this is kind of a larger scale inverter. It's a 2,000-watt pure sine wave inverter, and it takes the 12-volt DC and turns it into AC power, like you'd have wall power, yeah? So if you are going to look at doing a tiny home or off-grid shelter and those types of things, this definitely would be kind of the step up, if you will. It allows you to run any of the 1,000-watt AC cooking units that I showed earlier. Plus, in addition, it allows you to step up to running a microwave and that kind of thing. Now, generally speaking, when it comes to the AC elements and those types of stuff, I tend to shy away from using them just because of the power consumption that they have. But I do think that microwaves are an efficient item when it comes to what they can do. You know, and that's kind of why, primarily why I would want to step up to using a 2,000-watt inverter. You know, the 1,000-watt inverter is enough to run the smaller AC elements and the little barbecue thing like I showed earlier, if you will, and those types of things. But this allows me to step up to running a microwave. And, you know, when you sit back and say, okay, well, yeah, but microwave use massive amounts of power, it does, you know, but I can also turn around and bring a cup of water from ice cold up to a boil in like 2 minutes in a microwave. you know, so you're not running them for extended lengths of time. So the efficiency of the power being consumed, if you will, yeah, it hits the batteries hard and it hits them fast, but it normally you're not running a microwave for, you know, half an hour at a time, you know, and if you are, then you maybe need to reevaluate what you're doing in that regard. But generally speaking, if I wanted to step up to microwave technology, I would have to go up to a larger inverter. You know, other than that, when I'm out in the field and I'm wanting to keep things, you know, as light as possible and mobile and those types of things, hopefully you could see by the things I kind of mentioned in the examples I've shown in the video earlier, the 12 volt options really are kind of the simpler, more available options. You know, I'll just shift this inverter over because I didn't have it wired in at this point in time. And kind of do a quick showing if I can of, I'll move this tripod over a bit and change the angle down. You know, I've got tiny inverters that I can hook onto things, and they're designed with cigarette lighter plugs and those types of things where I can just simply plug my cigarette lighter. Let me see if I can dig it out of the box here. So I've got my cigarette lighter adapter, and generally speaking I have them wired up to the positive and negative on the batteries on all my stacks of batteries. But it's easy enough for me to turn around and say, all right, well, I want to run small AC scale power, and then I'll just shift back here and see if the camera can give this jump. And I've got, I know I'm kind of improvising it with the camera, but I've got AC plugs and USB right here that I can run. Now this unit only provides me with about 125 watts worth of power AC. But if I'm not cooking food with this and I'm just wanting to use this to run shavers and those types of things, and generally speaking I tend to prefer using the 12 volt to cook my food with, it allows me to have small scale AC devices that I can easily plug in, and it gives me the ability for USB without having to commit to one of those big expensive 2000 watt inverters. Like I say, the only reason why I'd want to step up to that was if I was running power tools and microwaves and those types of things out in the wilderness. But as soon as you do that, I'll just pull that back off. But as soon as you do that, and as you can see, it's just a tiny little unit, right? And then normally I just push that down to kind of keep it out of the way. But as soon as you do that, you're having to step up to larger solar charge controllers, because you're having to set up larger solar panel arrays, which become more noticeable, especially if you're off-grid. One of the elements to being kind of covert and off-grid is stealth, right? So if you've got a kilowatt worth of solar panels sitting out in the woods somewhere, you know, that could be spotted from the air a lot easier than, say, a single 200 watt panel or you know, 400 watts worth of power. You know, it's the larger in scale you step up in these things, the more noticeable they become. You know, in this unit here, it can handle up to 20 amps. So, you know, it can handle up to, you know, a significant amount of power in that regards before it becomes a problem. You know, and I can daisy chain together, you know, about 400 watts worth of panels before I start to kind of worry about overloading this thing. You know, 300, 400 watts for the panels, that kind of thing. But if you're sticking primarily to DC powered cooking, that could easily run everything you need to run for an off-grid setup for years and years and years to come, yeah? Alright, well, fellow YouTubers, this pretty well wraps up the video at this point in time. Like I say, hopefully you got something out of this. Generally speaking, like I say, I find that using 12 volt power is a more efficient option when it comes to being able to cook off food and stuff. Now, there is a convenience sake to being able to use AC power and have it like the familiarity of being in your home and those types of things. But all in all, you know, unless I'm doing off larger batches of water and I want to use like the immersion heater and that type of thing, you know, generally speaking, I'm wanting to go with the 12 volt DC stuff. It works a bit slower. Like I say, to bring chicken from raw to fully cooked up in the oven takes about 2 hours. You know, to run these pots takes, you know, an hour. To have a, you know, fairly full pot come up to a boil and cook everything in it and all that kind of stuff. And to run the stoves, like I say, this stove element, I can bring 2 cups of water from ice cold to a boil in 28 minutes. You know, this doesn't reach the same kind of high temperatures as like the AC element does and that type of thing. But at using 1/10 the power, I accept the reality that even though it runs a little bit slower, the amount of savings I'm getting on my battery is justifiable to that kind of delay in time, if you will. But like I say, if you're looking at doing kind of off-grid solutions for tiny homes, when it comes to cooking food and that type of thing, or, off-grid cabins, or you're wanting to do stealth underground shelters or whatever it is, for the end of the world and blah, blah, blah. If those are, your options that you're looking at of kind of wanting to move forward on, hopefully this gives you a good bearing to kind of how you could sustainably cook as you move through time, yeah? So if you enjoy this type of content, please like, share, and subscribe. And thanks for watching. Cheers.